Welcome to the recording. Thanks everyone for being here. If you haven't already RSVP'd, we are going to send a follow-up. So just want to make sure I've captured your email addresses. So just do RSVP if you want that follow-up. So I have that if you haven't already. And then I also invite all of you to join Edgewater Environmental Coalition for our winter solstice event that we're going to be doing at the lakefront, and try to keep cozy out in the cold on December 21st. We're going to do a little bonfire and we'll have some sparkling beverages and it'll be a grand old time. So I invite you all to join us for that as well. And I think we got everyone from the waiting room in here, Monica. I'll keep an eye on that and I will turn it over to you and make you host as well.
Spectacular. Well, welcome everybody. It's such a pleasure to be with you all tonight. As Renee said, definitely cozy, chilly vibes over here in Edgewater, I think. So just to introduce myself, my name is Monica. I am both a member of EEC and the other co-hosting org for tonight, which is the Edgewater Mutual Aid Network, EMON. This event is the end of a 6-event series for now that has all been focused on community building and resiliency. This was the kind of event that I really wanted to see more of in the community, and so I'm grateful to EEC for providing a platform and resources to compensate our speakers to host a series of workshops around these ideas. And if anyone's excited about this and feels energized and wants to keep organizing work like this with me in the future, hit my line because I'd love to do more. But for tonight, I'm really excited to focus on disaster resiliency and what that means for us in a community context, in an Edgewater context. I think that looking at disaster preparedness through a mutual aid context is both really important and underdone. And so Zoe is really a leader in this space. I found her on TikTok. Her TikTok is fantastic. So later we'll hear from her, but because she is based down south, I wanted to take a moment to ground us in the Chicago context so that if we're thinking about this in the context of our communities in Chicago, for those that are in Chicago, I think it's helpful to sort of contemplate what we might be experiencing and what impacts that might have on the space we share together and our community. So I think lastly, the one thing I want to say before I jump into that presentation is a little bit of Q&A etiquette. So feel free to pop questions in the chat during the presentations. If they're clarifying, we'll try to get to them. If not, we'll leave them to the end. There will be some discussion. And at the end, I think you can feel free to do the hand raising and talking. But until then, so that way no one gets flustered and gets interrupted, we can just keep it to the chat if that's cool with you guys. Awesome. So as I am preparing to share my screen, I do want to ask, I'm curious how many of you are based here in Chicago? And because this is virtual, how many folks might be from outside Chicagoland? So I guess maybe if people are willing to put in the chat where they're coming to us from tonight, that would be helpful. And then I know how much to generalize my presentation as well. Okay, cool. Lots of Chicago Edgewater folks. Beautiful. Okay, perfect. Okay, I have enough data points so we can gear this towards Edgewater. That will be great. Okay, cool. Let me share my screen. Oh, Renee. It says host disabled participant screen sharing still. Okay, oh, there we go. Beautiful, you fixed it. Thank you. Okay. I'm gonna hit slideshow, and can someone unmute to tell me if it looks like it's supposed to? Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so I want to just kind of ground us in like what I'm trying to do with this presentation. You know, I think we've all heard about climate change in many forms before, maybe related to the Midwest or not. So I'm just trying to think about the impacts in our community, and I think that's kind of the goal of me running through this. So I want to focus on just a handful of the primary climate impacts in Northeast Illinois overall. So temperature is a big one, of course. So here are some graphs that I think, or tables I think that are particularly helpful. So one thing that I think is 2 points that I think are very interesting. First of all, in terms of the temperature changes. So we have, first of all, temperature overall has been increasing, right? Like we're expecting warmer temperatures. It's a big part of climate change. But an interesting aspect of this is that it is concentrated particularly in the winter and the summer, as well as in night times. So the nighttime higher heat has impacts related to health, but I think overall too, considering that it's not a uniform effect, that it does vary by season, and that's kind of captured in the center graph here. I think that another visual that I found really helpful was looking at this one on the right, thinking about kind of how Illinois will compare to other regions in the U.S. as time passes. There also was, conversations around the extremely cold days. I will say, I think one of the sort of regular climate stressors on our communities is thinking about the impact of cold, and that does decrease under climate change, which I guess is maybe a very small silver lining. For precipitation, the two factors here that I think are the most prominent are that we're going to be experiencing warmer and wetter winters. So overall, you can look again, there's like a seasonality to the precipitation change. And I think the name of the game with both precipitation and temperature is that it's not like an overall consistent increase, it's really an increase in variability. So you can see here that like there is, if you look at the change in precip, there is like really extreme wetness in the winter and the spring, but then there's also drying out in the summer and a little bit of dry or neutral in the fall. So it's not so much that we're receiving uniformly more precipitation, but that there's this like extreme variation. And speaking of extreme variation, the other major trend is that there's going to be an increase in heavy precipitation events. So 99th percentile, right, being events that are really extreme on that heavy end of the spectrum. And you can see what the percent change, this is historic, but like what the percent change has been over time, that there's been almost a 40% change in our region within the last 50 or so years. So I think that both of those trends are important, and especially as we think about our urban context, the increased precipitation trends will put pressure on stormwater infrastructure and cause urban flooding like we saw in September in our neighborhood. Ecosystem trends, also impacts us. I think obviously we are in an urban area, but we depend on regional agriculture as well as we have our own ecosystems within the city. So overall, I think one thing I thought was pretty interesting was when it comes to forestry, obviously trees are really important in reducing urban heat impacts. And one study I found that was really interesting, or I guess I should say project really, was Chicago has already started to plant trees that are more aligned with southern climates. So in anticipation that they'll be here for decades. And so as climate changes, you want trees that are more acclimated to warmer climates. So we're already doing some work there in terms of adaptation. Obviously, invasive species put great pressure on the Great Lakes. I kept a slide in here initially, they took it out, but there's going to be a lot of variability too in terms of the precipitation's impact on the Great Lakes. It's interesting because the lake levels are going to stabilize because the sort of temperature evaporation effect is counterbalanced by the increased precipitation, but we'll continue to see more variability there as well. And then lastly, with agriculture, there's going to be pretty significant decreases in yields over time, looking at some staple crops here over time in the Midwest. So when it comes to sort of local food ecosystem and trying to get food locally or local farmers, they're going to face a pretty uphill battle with those yield decreases. And so lastly, I want to kind of talk about health impacts and EJ a little bit. So I have like a bunch of just like fast facts on the left. But overall, I think some of the things we're going to see are reduced air quality, increased allergens. With these increased heat days, we're going to see more potential heat waves, which impacts health. I thought this ground ozone fact I found was interesting, that we're going to see more premature deaths from that. So overall, this is not the most exciting slide, but I think also thinking about these health impacts really helps us understand as a community what pressure we're going to be feeling. So this chart here, this is kind of not meant to be enlarged, it's a little blurry, but you can see that as time passes, we're going to see more and more heat waves per decade. And also this change in the ragweed pollen season I found pretty depressing as someone who gets really irritated by ragweed every year, that that can continue to increase. I also think, as down here, we talked about high temperatures impact worker health and safety. I know there's been really interesting legislation coming out of California around that. And with more and more heat waves, it impacts everybody, and that's important to think about. And then lastly, it would be remiss not to, when talking about Chicago and the impacts of climate change, not to consider as well the disparities that we see across the city. It's no surprise that rampant discrimination over the course of decades, including redlining, creates these sorts of impacts, both in flooding on the left here, as well as heat vulnerability on the right. And so I think that's another key. If we're thinking about communities in the city and we're thinking about what we're seeing in impacts, it's really important that we think sort of across our neighborhoods into what citywide needs are and how we can support other communities in the city. So I just really wanted to highlight that as well. So I think lastly, to kind of wrap things up, really the question is, to me, is like, what will our communities need as climate changes, right? What do these different impacts really mean for us on the ground here? And so I guess I want to encourage you all to maybe pop something in the chat really quickly if folks are comfortable sharing, just to see if people have ideas around this based on kind of what I've shared so far. Going into Zoe's presentation, thinking about preparedness, what impacts do you see from these climate impacts that we'll be feeling in our community? And I'm going to stop my share so I can see your responses. Local.
The waiting room text too, Monica.
Yes, I can do that. Cooling centers. Thinking about the impacts that flooding has on people's possessions, I think especially folks that might be living outside. Awesome. Well, let's keep those impacts in mind. Better drainage and flooding. Yes, Regina. Awesome. Well, we can keep those impacts in mind as we transition to listening to Zoe and thinking a little bit more about these impacts in a preparedness context. So, Zoe, I will let you take it away and introduce yourself, and I will transfer host ownership to you so you can present.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. I hope you learned something from what I have to share. There's a good chance that you already know a good amount of it, but here we go.
Yeah, just hit slideshow and then.
Yes, I couldn't see it for a second.
Perfect. It looks great.
Thank you. So, I'm here to talk about prepping with a mutual aid mindset, and you could also sub mutual aid with community mindset. So, I am Zoë Higgins. I'm originally from Tennessee, and I graduated in 2015 from Earlham College. I didn't do anything about prepping when I was in college. I actually studied English and women's studies. And I'm currently in grad school at Widener to obtain a master's in social work. As Monica said, I create prepping content on TikTok, and that's how I initially got really interested in the intersections of community and prepping. So I moved to New Orleans in 2017, and if you know anything about New Orleans or living on the Gulf Coast, the first thing we're taught is how to prep for hurricanes. And they say, keep 3 days worth of food and water. People just say that over and over and over again down here. So of course, my first summer living here had my introduction to a really small tropical storm coming in, but it was my first storm ever. And so I was very concerned, and I took it very seriously. And I remember going to Walmart and the water was all gone from the shelves. And that was my first brush with what happens in the immediate days before an expected climate event is happening. And since then I've slowly been building up my supplies, and I use TikTok to connect with other like-minded preppers or people just interested in prepping. You can be interested in prepping and not be a quote prepper. I also this year got CERT trained through FEMA, which is something anybody can do. It's called Community Emergency Response Team. And you essentially work side by side to help support emergency services during disasters. So prepping comes with a lot of stigmas, the term prepping does. And in media, you've probably seen some really radical examples of this. Radical examples like A&E has that show called Doomsday Preppers. And I know before I started prepping that I thought only quote unquote crazy people, conspiracy theorists were into prepping. I didn't realize that there was a functional use for incorporating that into your own life. The history of it is it's heavily associated with conservative groups. And there's actually a lot of history behind prepping. It's a staple in Mormon and LDS beliefs. So there's like a lot of basements filled with dry goods in Utah. They believe that they are biblically told to prep for end times. The big stigma that comes with prepping is that you have to use guns and weapons to defend your stockpile, quote unquote. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But the traditional mainstream prepping idea is pretty anti-community, and it's focused on your immediate family and yourself. So you've probably been familiar with these myths about prepping. All preppers are conservative. Preppers have bunkers with massive stockpiles. You have to own a gun to be a prepper, and only conspiracy theorists believe in prepping. But the reality is that preppers come from all over the political spectrum, and those massive basement stockpiles we see videos of and images of in media really aren't very common at all. Sure, there are people who do have massive stockpiles, but it's not common. True disaster preparedness doesn't necessitate weapons, and most preppers just want to be ready for common weather disasters. I got into prepping because I just want to be safe and comfortable during a hurricane. It was that simple for me. So there is this myth of protecting your supply. There is this huge narrative that comes with doomsday preppers, where they say the first rule of prepping is to never tell anybody that you prep. With the implication that anarchy reigns after disasters and people are going to be knocking down your door, trying to steal your supplies. But the reality is that doesn't happen post-disaster. And I, for one, personally believe that mutual aid and community makes us stronger after disaster. And I just don't believe in the anarchy myth and essentially resource guarding. So I would like to introduce you to this term practical prepping. That's what I call what I do. It's going to move away from the traditional doomsday prepper myths that we talked about. It includes all community members and any niche groups that you are tapped into. It should include that. Believes in the power of communities coming together after disaster, and we are grounded in reality. So in this talk, you're not really going to hear me talk about prepping for any vague apocalyptic scenario, because that's not why I'm prepping. And I think that stigma kind of needs to be shed from mainstream prepping. Is the process of preparing oneself to survive without a complex infrastructure, such as what exists in modern society for any amount of time. So that could be 3 days in terms of like a minor hurricane coming in, or several weeks. The extent to which you prep your own household is really dependent on your climate. Like for me, 3 days is my baseline, what you're comfortable doing and what you're financially able to do. So if you start going on prepping blogs, you're going to see a lot of things, but you're going to see these terms. Bugging in and bugging out, that essentially just means, are you staying home or are you evacuating? Of course, there are weather events that we cannot anticipate and natural disasters that we don't see coming. So for those, you're bugged in, but evacuating too. BOB stands for bug out bag. So the bag that you want to have in a central location in your home that has 3 days of supplies. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Bug out location where you evacuate to. Everyday carry is maybe a backpack or a bag that you always keep in your car or on your person. That, like, I have, what are they called? Not jumper cables, but I have a portable battery pack that can jumpstart my car wherever I am. And that's in my everyday carry. That's always in my car. JIC, just in case. Like, I keep dehydrated sampled, what are those called? Drip drops. I keep drip drops in case somebody in my family becomes dehydrated, just in case. And then you're going to see SHTF, shit hits the fan. You're going to see that on a lot of blogs, and that does kind of still loom near the doomsday prepping mentality. But I mean, shit hits the fan during a hurricane, and I'm sure you've seen it during winter storms or other flooding events. So my history in prepping, Hurricane Ida came into New Orleans last year. And during this time, you have to keep in mind the entire infrastructure of the city completely shuts down. Stores are closed. There's no gasoline. If there's any gasoline, there's going to be a 4-hour wait, and you probably aren't going to be the first one there to get it. The power grid in New Orleans was completely demolished, and it took over a week and a half for the most urban areas to get power back. So my husband and I packed up our car with 4 animals, 2 dogs and 2 street cats that we were feeding, and brought them to my family's home in Tennessee and watched the storm come into the city and tried to decide our next steps. So something really interesting happens during a disaster when you evacuate. And I don't know if any of you have ever had to evacuate in a scenario like that, but this was my first time since I moved to New Orleans really having that experience. And your immediate concern is you want to get back as soon as possible, and you're not really concerned about the power grid down. You want to get back because you want to help. That was my gut intuition. So I had been scanning the mutual aid groups prior to the day we evacuated, and people were asking for direct funds so that they were able to evacuate, or extra water if they weren't going to evacuate, those sorts of things. And I was hearing reports of like no batteries, no battery powered fans available in the city. And the ambient temperature around this time of year in August is over 100 degrees during the day. The heat down here with the humidity is really, really brutal. So I wanted to be able to help. In Tennessee, all of the Walmarts were functioning like normal. So I hopped on Instagram and asked if anybody wanted to help my husband and I bring some supplies down. We were leaving in the next couple days. And to my shock, I raised over $1,100. And that was just from immediate friends of mine. And we were able to deliver supplies to 15 different families, all of whom had not evacuated for whatever reason. And that's a separate conversation, is respecting people's decision to stay. But the supplies included over 100 batteries, cooling towels and fans, a lot of pet food, cat litter, snacks, and portable chargers that we were able to charge before we distributed them. So we even had to buy this rack for the roof of my car and for the back to get everything down. We had to bring in our own gasoline, and we had to be really resourceful about using that gasoline to deliver supplies because we had a finite amount, obviously, and we needed to get it back to Tennessee, or at least far enough out of the city that we were able to get gas again. 122 D batteries specifically, because portable fans, we bought out portable fans from 2 separate Walmarts and bought all the ones that they had, but they're either USB powered or D battery powered. So the number one request from people was D batteries, and we were able to distribute all of these. My biggest lessons in experiencing Hurricane Ida and the recovery afterwards is that the more prepared my family was, the more we were able to help others. The mutual aid network was absolutely essential in low impact, but significant impact we were able to make. And I learned that mutual aid during disaster is the difference between failing and being resilient. Preppers can offer a lot in mutual aid disaster because my husband and I were allowed, we were able to pack up our car filled with supplies to the brim, and we didn't have to bring a single item back for ourselves, which was so significant to me. And it really validated to me that I'd been successful in my prepping, because at our house in New Orleans was all of our emergency food, emergency water, camping stoves, all of that stuff. And so we were really able to not have to worry about ourselves and focus more on who we were able to help. So I'm transitioning now into talking about a 72-hour kit. Monica has some resources that I believe are going to be emailed out after this, but I'm not going to show you an exhaustive checklist right now. It would not even fit on the screen, but a checklist will be sent out to you after this if you are interested. So to build an effective kit, you really need to assume that the power is out. Most stores or all stores are closed, like the infrastructure isn't really working, and prep for your specific climate. So for food, you have a lot of options. My favorite option is freeze-dried food, and the Mountain House brand and the Augustin Farms brands, not sponsored, but they are known to be really reliable brands for such things. This is another time when you need to consider your climate, because canned foods have an enormous shelf life, but high heat will diminish their quality and eventually make them inedible or spoil them much faster. I believe according to the CDC, they say 3 days of temperatures over 90 degrees will spoil canned shelf-stable foods. So that's why, living in New Orleans, I want to focus on having freeze-dried foods for my family, because if the power's out, it's going to be over 100 degrees and all that food would be wasted. Another thing to consider when you're stocking up your food is make sure that it's food that you like and that you enjoy eating. Nobody wants to be opening up a can of plain green beans because they only stocked up, canned vegetables. They have these specific brands. I've tried most of their freeze-dried meals and I personally love them. The only one I didn't love was the chicken teriyaki. The flavor was a little off, but it's any camping freeze-dried meals you see are excellent options. When you're talking about your food storage, you need to also have your gear with it. So camping stove, extra fuel for that, and a can opener. Redundancy is something you're going to see a lot in prepping, and that means not just having one can opener, having 2 of them, because if one fails, then what are you going to do? We have 2 separate camping stoves. One is like a little flip up emergency one, and one is a larger, more utilitarian one. You're also going to want to consider how much space you have in your house. We have one corner of my spouse's office kind of dedicated to prepping stuff, and that's the space we had. When I first started prepping, I lived in a super teeny tiny, like 600 square foot apartment, and I used the storage under my bed to store foods and supplies. The next thing you need to consider is water. The FEMA guideline is 1 gallon per person per day. That does not include water for cooking, for pets, or for hygiene or cleaning. So I always say one person should keep 4 to 5 gallons in a 72-hour kit and add more if you have pets. you can use storage containers pictured here, or just plain regular water bottles. And it's really up to you. I also would recommend having purification tablets or life straws as a backup option. There's also some like off-brand life straws that are just as great quality and just more affordable. I know Membrane Solutions is one brand. Those are great to have as a backup option just in case you do run out of water and have to seek another supply. The next thing to consider is your power source. Excuse me. Again, redundancy is key. You're not going to want to just have one power bank. You're going to want to have a few. So there at the top is a Jackery, and a Jackery is a power station. It's one specific brand of a power station. These are more expensive, but they are less expensive than generators. I consider generators a luxury item. They start around $800 and go up into the thousands. So I don't think that's like really an accessible option for most people. They also require you to bring in gasoline and comes with a lot of safety standards. So for the practical prepper, I would say start with power banks or a power station and then build from there. This will keep your devices charged, obviously, and help you stay connected to people. Also, keep in mind redundancy. Don't just have one extra charging cord. Have maybe 2 extra charging cords that you leave in your prep supply. Also, you should get an emergency NOAA radio. I cannot tell you enough how important these are. This will give you up-to-date, accurate information about what the weather's doing. Also, at the end, I'll share a resource with like my favorite options of these, but you can get one for under $30 that will also charge your phone, has a flashlight, and is crank or solar powered, which is wonderful. Also in your 72-hour kit, you need a first aid kit. You can build your own from scratch by going to the store, but frankly, buying a pre-made put together one is going to be easiest. If you take prescription medications, you're always going to want to have 3 days of medications in your stockpile. Unless it's a controlled substance, pharmacies will usually dispense extra to you before a storm. Like I take a medication that before I evacuated Ida, I called the pharmacy and let them know, and they gave me a week extra supply. Also, part of prepping is being ready for kind of any event. So consider taking a CPR class or a class offered by Red Cross. I've taken a few of their first aid classes and trauma classes, and I try to stay up to date with their CPR classes too, every few years. The last big item is important documents. So I don't know if you're like how I used to be, where I need my passport and I'm scrambling through all the drawers in my house, wondering where I put it. So now what I do is I have a binder that stays in the prep stuff. It has all of our birth certificates, marriage certificate, ID, any of that stuff is kept in there, copies of IDs. And spending the extra few dollars to make backup copies of everything is going to really help you out, because if you're at least able to prove that you have a certified copy somewhere if you can't find it. A really good tip I learned living in New Orleans is right before you have to evacuate for a foreseen weather event, walk around your whole house with your phone camera and film everything. It doesn't have to be neat and pretty or aesthetic. You just want to film everything, because then if you need to file an insurance claim, you will have proof of exactly how you left your house. So this is an example of a go bag. A go bag is kind of like a 72-hour kit condensed into a backpack. And this is a good option to have. And I will be frank, our go bag does not have absolutely everything in it, but it has 3 days of food and water, an emergency camping stove in it, that kind of thing. I'm not so much worried about clothes in it, but you can too. So I'm going to transition into talking about this. This is the 4 phases of emergency management. This is actually a FEMA model in emergency management on a government level, but I think looking at weather disasters from this lens can lend us some more information on how mutual aid and prepping can be fill in the gaps between what governments and other organizations aren't able to access as quickly. So prepping is obviously going to be like in the preparedness category of the 4 phases, but there's other ways you can prep in all 4 of these. And mutual aid, in my experience, is most important in the response and recovery time. Though I would love for us to take away that mutual aid can be part of the preparedness category too. So resiliency is rebuilding your community in order to thrive. And a way to do that is to look at other communities that have suffered a disaster and what did they do? Most commonly, and I'll talk about a case study here in a second, we see that the communities able to thrive after disaster had really strong networks of communication within them. It's also really important that your mutual aid group isn't silent and dark during calm, quote unquote, times in life. It's really important that your mutual aid group is well established and being engaged in on a regular basis. So when a weather event does happen, you're able to connect quickly and easily, and many people are able to do the same. Communication is the foundation of community efforts. That's why I always say step 1 in building community is exchanging phone numbers with your neighbors. Join online groups like your mutual aid Facebook group, check them often. Maybe it's even like a subreddit for your local community that's going on a lot. And be a neighbor, share your resources. That was my favorite part of everything we did during Hurricane Ida, was not having to worry about ourselves because we knew we were prepared. We were able to just focus on helping everybody else. So FEMA has this really fascinating tool called the FEMA hazard map. And I'm glad most people here are from Chicago, because that's the example I'm pulling. You can just Google FEMA hazard map yourself and toy around with all the widgets on it. I really encourage you. It's fascinating. So they assign a risk index, which is expected annual loss with social vulnerability divided by community resilience. And that is the risk index for a location. According to the FEMA hazard map, risk for Chicago. So you're probably not surprised by the lower moderate threats. Obviously, hurricanes aren't really coming in strong to Chicago. But your high threats, you have a double whammy of cold wave and heat waves, ice storms, flooding, lightning, tornado, and winter weather. So a lot of people in the doomsday prepper mentality think urban preparedness is a fallacy, and that more rural preparedness is where it's at. That's the safest place to be. But that's not absolutely true by any stretch of the imagination. A great thing about being in an urban environment and prepping is that you have the opportunity to build a large and diverse community. Mutual aid resources are more accessible, and urban areas are more resource efficient. It will also make mutual aid resources more easily able to be dispersed among people. So there's this paper called Climate Change in Cities, and it's an assessment report that came out of Cambridge by a group of authors. And it was a study featuring case studies of environmental impacts on cities. And it would be like a 3-hour seminar just to talk about that paper. But one of their major findings I found fascinating and really applicable to the conversation we're having now. The environmental baselines of cities have started to shift as climate change impacts take hold. More frequent climate and weather extreme events are being experienced in urban areas. The frequency of severe weather and climate-related disasters in urban areas is projected to increase. We know this. This is not brand new news. But so they looked at resiliency of cities after experiencing major disasters. And I found this so interesting in their major findings that strong institutions and communities were essential in improving the resilience and managing future risks in cities. One of the case studies featured in this paper was this flood that happened in 2013 in the urban area of Boulder County, Colorado. So this is an image from that disaster. Boulder received a year's worth of rain in just 1 week. And it caused a lot of mudslides. Entire roads and networks were completely wiped out. 18,000 people ended up evacuating. Over 1,800 homes were destroyed and 200 commercial structures were destroyed. It was a really devastating event that happened. And with the amount of damage, they were expecting the death toll to be really high. The final death toll ended up being 10, which is sad, but better than 100, I suppose. The response and recovery was so strong and well coordinated that they documented it in this case study. They outlined 4 components of the human systems that led to the resourcefulness and the resilience of Boulder County. Those things were support for individual capacity, developed networks and communities like mutual aid networks, maintained broad access to resources. So there was a lot of neighbors sharing resources with one another and communicating with first responders and utility companies coming in. Like there was an example of a utility company trying to fix some power lines, but not knowing the lay of the land that they were navigating, and the neighborhood coming in and interjecting and being like, this is actually where you can't do it here because of XYZ, because they know their land better than anybody. And then developed avenues for learning was the 4th component. Strong collaboration among county nonprofits, the faith community, and city governments dramatically aided the initial response to the floods. Active community groups, originally developed for other purposes, rapidly came together to aid victims. I find this totally applicable to what we're doing and really validating that mutual aid networks absolutely have a place in prepping and vice versa. I like to think of mutual aid in the prepping community as the grout between tiles. Mutual aid is able to help bridge access to resources while it takes a longer time for insurance companies to come in and responders and the government to repair things. And mutual aid can help fill in those gaps while people are waiting. The major lessons that came out of Boulder's flooding was that community groups are imperative to strong recovery and ultimate resilience. The city of Boulder was so impressed by this, and it was so factual that they ended up funding a lot of community-based groups after the flood, more so than before. Their main takeaways outlined in the paper were: our food and water come from distant sources beyond our control. Food, water, shelter, and livelihoods are often highly dependent on power and transportation systems, which can lead to a cascading failure of systems. And in-person interactions increasingly involve transportation over miles. And in times of crisis, we often do not know the people next door. So back to the basics: share your phone number with your neighbor, connect with your community, your immediate community, and beyond. I love this quote from Joel Islar about mutual aid. Mutual aid is when everyday people get together to meet each other's needs with the shared understanding that the systems we live in are not meeting our needs, and that we can meet them together right now without having to pressure power structures to do the right thing. Mutual aid is an idea and practice that is based on the principles of direct action, cooperation, mutual understanding, and solidarity. Mutual aid is not charity, but the building and continuing of new social relations. where people give what they can and give what they need outside of unjust systems of power. I know everybody here knows what mutual aid is. I just found that quote really grounding and applicable to what we're doing. So here are some really basic examples of community-minded prepping. And I would love to chat at the end about other ideas anybody has. So checking on neighbors before a storm comes, especially elderly neighbors. I used to live next to a couple of elderly women, and before a big tropical storm came in, I checked on them, and sure enough, they were like, oh, we have no bottled water, so that was something I was able to help connect them with. Also helping unhoused neighbors connect with resources like rides to shelter, using your internet or phone or laptop to connect to shelters, ensuring neighbors have their needs met after a big storm. So that means being prepared yourself so that you can better help others. Adding flashlights and other prep essentials to free pantries. I've added batteries, flashlights, some headlamps when I'm able to. Giving direct aid to neighbors who need money to evacuate, and spreading education to neighbors. Mutual aid during disaster, more immediate resources. Government agencies and insurance companies are really slow to move. So there's this nonprofit in not a nonprofit, I'm sorry, a group in New Orleans called Imagine Waterworks. And they coordinated some huge mutual aid efforts in the city during Hurricane Ida. And they've been working to reduce flooding and pollution risks for over a decade. So they're pretty well established. IWW was able to connect easily with other residents, and they helped gather and distribute aid and set up relief tents right away. They were actually on the ground setting up these relief tents before the National Guard was even doing it. So mutual aid really does fill the gaps of emergency response. And it's important to also remember that disasters don't affect everybody equally. Depending on your financial ability of if you even can evacuate, because evacuating is a very expensive thing unless you have a home to go to, and even then it's really expensive. And that's why I always say never judge anybody who didn't evacuate before a major storm like Katrina, because you truly do not know the circumstances that somebody is in. So talking about y'all's territory and winter storms, I'm sure at the end of this, I would love for you to type in to the chat some of your best winter storm preparation tips. I am not as familiar with winter storms. Obviously, living in New Orleans, it was 70 degrees yesterday. But obviously check on your neighbors. That is something you're going to be doing way before disaster strikes, but especially right before storms coming in. Ensure your 72-hour kit is ready. Your foods are rotated. It's a really freeing feeling when you see a storm coming and you don't have to run to the store last minute because you already have everything you need to get through that. Fill your gas tank, purchase emergency heating like emergency blankets, and ensure you have reliable shelter, and try to hunker down way before the storm starts so you don't find yourself in a scenario where you're stuck in your car, if you're able to, and know your evacuation route. It's always good to assume that the power is going to go out or the power grid is going to have some temporary failure. If you're using alternative ways to heat your home during a storm, please, God, make sure your carbon monoxide alarm is working. That's one of the major causes of fatalities after winter storms is carbon monoxide poisoning, because people are using some form of generator or other heating source and aren't using it in accordance with guidelines. Wear loose layers. We know that the air between the layers of your clothes, the warm air, that's what's keeping you warm. It's not necessarily tight fitting clothes doing that. When you're focusing on snacks to keep in your 72-hour kit, it's really important to focus on high calorie, nutrient dense snacks, because it takes a lot of calories and carbohydrates to keep your body warm. And same thing for preparing for a heat wave to come in. Southern facing window, if you can stay in a southern facing room, that's going to be great. If you can seal up your windows in the winter, and keep curtains shut at night and during the day if the sun is not out and it's windy. So prepping, like the number one thing I've heard on TikTok is people are like, oh, I would prep, but it's so expensive. I started prepping making very little money. And I did that by every time I went to this grocery store, I would just buy an extra can of food. And that's how I had my first 72-hour kit happen, is like once a week, I would just buy one item for my stockpile. If you go out and buy it all at once, it's going to be a bigger bill. It's important to know exactly what kinds of emergency disasters you're most vulnerable to. For example, I don't have emergency blankets in my prepping kit. Sure, I could get them. I just don't, because the risk of a massive cold wave coming through New Orleans is low to zero. Create an emergency communication plan with your family. Talk with your family about where you'd be if you needed to evacuate. A free thing that you can do that I've never regretted is signing up for your local emergency alerts and downloading apps, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And I know a lot of cities offer low cost or free CPR classes. And if you come across one yourself, blast that in your mutual aid groups, let other people know. So 2 apps you should have on your phone if you're interested in prepping, the FEMA app and this interesting app called Harbor. Harbor goes through checklists of everything you need for specific emergencies. I didn't hear about Harbor until I'd been well into my personal prepping journey, and I downloaded it thinking I really honestly had my bases covered, and I was surprised I didn't. I found some holes that I needed to patch up, so that was interesting. This book, it looks intimidating, but I swear it's not. I think every home should have the SAS Survival Handbook. It is a fascinating plethora of knowledge. Also, ready.gov, redcross.org, FEMA.gov. Ready.gov has so much information. You could probably look at their website for a week and still not be done. If you're interested in any blogs, the Listening to Katrina blog is one of the most harrowing, interesting blogs about this family who detail every minute-to-minute decision that they made when they did not evacuate during Katrina, and when they realized that the water was rising and that they needed to leave. And the author breaks down all the options of decisions that were on the table, which during a disaster, it changes minute to minute. And that was interesting. The Prepared blog has tons of resources. Also, this subreddit, prepping, has great resources. So if you're interested in anything I talked about product-wise, that QR code does go to my Amazon storefront. Do not feel obligated to buy through it. I understand if you want to get your sources somewhere else, full respect for that. And this is my TikTok and my email. I would love to have you as part of our little community. And now I would like to open up to our chat. How do I give this back to you?
Yeah, I think usually there's like a thing at the top that says stop sharing screen. Are you seeing that?
Cool. Yes, I am.
Beautiful.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. We did have one question come through if we want to jump into questions, and then I just want to encourage folks again to pop questions in the chat that you may have. Somebody had sent this to Renee in a DM, so I'm just gonna read it.
Okay.
Gotta scroll back up. I think you could maybe speak to this from your awareness or experience, but they're wondering if anyone knows what would have to be done to make the lake water, so the fresh water in Lake Michigan, safe to drink, if anything. Because we live, as you may or may not know, directly next to Lake
Right.
Michigan. So it's a great potential source of fresh water, but I'm curious if you know anything about that.
I know that Life Straw's guarantee is that they can filter any water source anywhere. They can filter even a salt water. So I would start, so I would start with the Life Straw. I don't know specifically about the water quality there though, but if you, while you're shopping for water purification options, you'll see they'll list out exactly what they can purify and what they cannot. It just depends on the brand, or if it's a tablet versus a Life Straw. And Life Straw makes not only straws, but like whole water bottles and portable jugs too.
Yeah, that's great. And Renee made a great point in the chat that that is where we get our treated drinking water. So if we treat it safely through another
Right.
mechanism, that makes sense that it would work.
I absolutely believe that, like the Life Straw or purification tablets, I can't imagine that, especially if your drinking water comes from there, that it could be different.
Awesome. So even though this presentation was more geared toward community action and mutual aid, Pierce has a question about this in the chat. What policies could our local government or older people, in the case of our city, enact that might help neighbors? So he's kind of curious maybe what could be requested. I'm wondering if you or orgs in your city have kind of supported anything that has been helpful.
That's a really, really good question. I wish I had a better answer. I think, okay, so anecdotally, the government in New Orleans is notoriously corrupt. Like that's not speculation. It is like a proven thing. There are a lot of like misdirected funds and a lot of local politicians who regularly get jail sentences. So it's pretty chaotic down here. We have to rely a lot on community network and the nonprofits to really get things functioning. But I would say as like a general thing in any community, supporting infrastructure and evacuation emergency plans. Every city has an emergency department that's in charge of that.
Okay.
The
He's
FEMA has the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. Yes, that's interesting. Yeah, it should be, sorry, I saw the question, the Harbor app. Let me make sure, but it should just come up in the App Store as Harbor. Yeah, I'm not sure where it is. I'm not seeing it right now, but I have it on my phone. Yeah. Well, I'll try to find a direct link to it and send it out in that email, Monica.
great. That would be awesome. And as we're kind of looking, I'm one thing I'm doing right now is looking through the chat. I just want to shout out everybody for having such great suggestions about winterizing and resiliency there. Well, I was going to follow up on that, but there's some good questions. Mariah just asked a question. Mariah, I'm almost wondering, I don't know if you, not to put you on the spot, do you want to come off mute and ask this since you have some context to share?
Sure. Hello.
Hi.
It was just I was sharing something one of my friends had told me to try doing when we were discussing sort of preparedness for the community, and it was just to take walks and make use of your walks around your neighborhood as like kind of a daily check-in with some of those things you were talking about like noticing who's in your community, introducing yourself to people in your community, and like actually having kind of a building checklist of resources like water, or oh, over here there's a garden, or you know, could even be where are the utilities, where might they go down. People have died, for example, accidentally touching down electrical lines, so it's like to some degree good just to keep in mind like, oh, I can't, if things are down and I shouldn't go over where the big power lines are. Things like that.
I love that a lot. Walking around your neighborhood and like constantly observing and talking with members. This is actually the reason I, with dedication, dedicate that or decorate the outside of my house every, because it's an opportunity for neighbors to connect with me, or they see me putting lights up, and or they walk by and they're like, I love your lights, and then it leads to a conversation. It sounds silly, but it really is why I do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I actually was introducing myself to somebody on my street just because she had put up a bunch of decorations.
Right.
And I ended up connecting with a lot of my neighbors over Halloween who came by um, because I kind of did a display of mushrooms because I like mushrooms, and then got like the iNaturalist username of a couple of different neighbors. And then it's like I can see what animals they're all seeing and kind of keep in touch over that.
I love that. I do love that. That I like that you brought up down power lines, because I didn't include that. But if winter storms or tropical storms or major severe weather, you should absolutely not be in a hurry to leave your house at all, because down power lines do lead to a lot of fatalities and debris on the ground. Also, I didn't mention this, but just another tip for people who have cars. It's a really good idea to keep a tire patch kit in your car. You can get it for free, or not free, you can get it for cheap, like really like $4 at Harbor Freight. And like during hurricanes, roof shingles come off and those roofing nails land in the street. And the last thing you want is to have a flat tire, so you can patch it up real quick. We had to patch like the tire 3 times when we came back during Hurricane Ida.
It's a great tip. Leah, I see your hand is raised.
Hi, I was just the question Pierce asked before about things that like policies the community could do. I definitely like the warming centers here are never open um as like at temperatures they need to be. They wait until it's far colder than is reasonable, and then they're not always open all night. And we certainly don't have enough of them. So like I think that's something to really push for if you're someone who's interested in electoralism. On the other side, building, I know like there are people in our community in Edgewater who run the Bryn Mawr Warming Center, and that they're sort of, rather than trying to do that through pushing the aldermen, have just decided to set it up themselves throughout the winter with tents and heaters as a community space. But yeah, that's what I was thinking on policy. I was also thinking, I guess there are probably, I have no idea if a winter storm would get bad enough that we would evacuate, but typically I think that winter storms are a little bit more hunker down than evacuate.
Mhm.
But I mean, flooding, there could be another question, but thinking of, how do you manage the idea of like, oh, when you go out to help your neighbors versus when you stay in, because there are people who are unhoused who at the coldest time of year need people to go outside to like bring them resources they need, and that's also the exact time of year that like we're all bunkering, and that's less storm I guess and more extreme cold, but not really a
Right.
question, just some thoughts.
Thank you. I think that's interesting, and I wish I had the magic solution for how to best support unhoused neighbors during extreme cold or extreme heat. Um, I know like during an active storm, you obviously like it's in your best interest to be hunkered down. And if you have the foresight and the forecast knowing that it's coming, what's stopping you, from being able to distribute supplies? And that's another reason why prep today is the best day to start prepping. Tomorrow is the second best day to start prepping, because if there's a storm coming, I'm able to spend my finite financial resources on helping get resources to unhoused neighbors or other people in the community, versus my family we already have everything we need to ride that out.
Yeah. Well, and on the note too about thinking about resources that can be shared, especially in the context of cold with neighbors, I think somebody had put in the chat thinking about like putting hand warmers and little free libraries or emergency blankets. Like what's nice about those, I know Zoe last year did a really good like Black Friday deals, like in the prepping context, where it was
Oh
like,
yeah.
get these things are even cheaper than cheap. Like just these stuff is good to have on hand. And so like one of the questions I'm asking myself through listening to this presentation is like within EMON, within our mutual aid network in Edgewater, um, obviously there's that sort of the financial assistance with like getting folks hotel rooms, which Mariah had just mentioned in the chat, but also like, would it make sense for us to get like a bulk pack of hand warmers or a bulk pack of emergency blankets and stuff like that, and maybe hand those out during our weekly food distribution, or like have those on
Definitely.
hand to give to people. Yeah. Um,
I love that. I think that's a great idea. I like a small way I do that is I part of in my prep. So aside from hurricanes, we also prepare for like major heat waves because those are often hand in hand. So I buy instant cold packs in bulk on Amazon. And so they come in a pack of 40 and it's really affordable. And so after a storm, like during a heat wave, I can just easily distribute those to people and it's immediate cold. And that's been because I know we don't have unlimited funds coming from ourselves, but that's like a way I can do something. Oh, that's a good question. Can I look at the chat? So Pierce asked, what items do you not skimp on price when building prep kits? I'm often at discount food stores and some things just feel like they're the same quality no matter the price, like alcohol pads, hydrogen peroxide. Yeah. So for me, that's a really good question. Um, the food that I have now in my emergency supply kit is higher quality than I was buying when I first started prepping. That's mostly because I did get very sick of off the shelf canned foods and found it disgusting. So I now like during Hurricane Ida when we returned and we were without power still and my husband and I like we looked so forward to that hot camping meal at the end of the day with no power and it's hot, but it's so good. And we were eating like fettuccine Alfredo and like spaghetti with meatballs. Like the camping food, freeze dried options are phenomenal. And when you're in the thick of it in recovery mode after disaster, I really cannot tell you how soul filling a hot meal felt. So definitely food. Also, power banks, I probably wouldn't skimp too much there. Like my NOAA radio, it was still only $30, but which is more or less depending on your context. But I want my power banks to be of good quality because I need to keep that communication open as everybody should. I'll still think about that. I think water is where I'm the cheapest because I don't have, we just have water bottles, but we don't have storage containers for our water personally.
when I think thinking about price, Zoe, just to add some commentary, I think one of the takeaways I have from your conversation today as well is like, for folks that are listening, right, like it's just as simple as like looking in that 72-hour kit list and thinking about like, okay, let's make sure I have a flashlight, maybe consider getting a weather radio, try to have some canned food. Like I think there's a lot of really accessible and really cost effective, simple things you can do just to have a little bit more stability and a little bit more.
Exactly. That's absolutely true. And that's why I say like unless you're absolutely gung-ho on it, there is no reason you need to go out and spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars today to get all ready. I've been doing this for 5 years and I still regularly, like each paycheck, dedicate X amount of money toward a little bit of prep, whether that's just replenishing some batteries or, I've had that headlamp for a few seasons and it's not as bright anymore. Maybe I want a better one, something like that. And that's interesting, Renee, your question about non-plastic options. I have seen some people do aluminum cans, but they were a lot more expensive. But it's also not as common, and I know it runs the risk of leaving like a very metallic-y taste. But it is kind of a shame that the number one way to store water is through is plastic. But if people had other ideas, and go run for it, truly.
Yeah, I see that Renee mentioned using old growlers. Yeah, I
Hmm.
think one of the things
Oh, it's all a balance too, right? Like do what you
Right,
can. Yeah, do what makes sense.
absolutely.
and I guess I know that there is potential safety issues with like having water in a container for a long amount of time, especially if it's like glass and there's clearness and there's light coming through. So um, I know enough to know that there's something to be looked into there for safety. I don't know enough to offer any guidance right now, but
I'm sure if you look on that prepared blog I mentioned, you can just Google Be Prepared. They have articles on all of that.
yeah, yep. And yeah, and Mariah, pro dehydrated food, yes.
Yes. So you're absolutely right, Mariah. I know a lot of people have a dehydrator. I used to have a dehydrator. I'm not gonna lie. I personally got lazy. I thought I would love it. I like saved up for this dehydrator. I thought it was gonna be the best thing to happen to my personal prep. And then I got really lazy. But that's also because I realized I needed a way to seal the cans, because dehydrated food, it'll last longer than not, but it doesn't have the shelf stable time that I'm looking for personally. My shelf stable foods range from 5 years to 20 years. And I haven't had the chance to wait 20 years, but yeah, so we cycle through them.
Yeah, I will say too, I dehydrate a lot of food, mostly just because I try to preserve veggies that I have in excess of over the summer. And I bought those like oxygen absorber packets, and so that was one thing I did too to like help keep them
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And
And
those are really
I
affordable.
I didn't mention this, but I should have, is Mylar bags are a great option. The Wallaby brand Mylar bags, you can use my code leftprep5 if you want money off, but in all honesty, any Mylar brand bag, and you can just seal it with a hair straightener, and then you put an oxygen absorber in it. And I've done that for our Winn-Dixie store. They do BOGO deals on like pretzels and chips and stuff like that. And so I'll get the BOGO pretzels and then just seal them up in Mylar bags. So it's nice to have like a little comfort snack food in your prep pile too.
Lots of discourse about the benefit of dehydrators. One other thing I wanted to add to just sort of replug Iman as like a co-host of this event and organization that like I'm really supportive of. You know, I think Zoe, one of the things you mentioned is like being plugged into these networks and having them be visible, like you said, post, you know, in these moments of calm. Uh, Not that our world ever really feels calm, but I just wanted
Right,
to
right.
just mention, maybe I'll put the link to the Iman webpage in the chat. And if folks want to sign up for the newsletter, you know, I think in terms of a prepping context, it could be great to be on the newsletter. And that way, if something happens, then you know that you'll be getting email updates about what's going on. We also have like Signal and Slack and all that. And folks can feel free to message me too if you want to get plugged into that. But um, that could be another step to make towards prepping. It's connecting
Yes,
with us.
I love that. Um,
um,
if anybody has any last questions, if you want to plug them in the chat, or any thoughts too.
yeah, I was gonna say too, I know that earlier in the cold weather discussion, there were some great ideas for like steps we could take as a community too. So if there's anybody's leaving today with thoughts on like what we could do together to create more, build more resiliency in the community, like we can just make this also a space for brainstorming and excitement. I think that's awesome too. Yeah, Pierce lives with me, so he benefits from my little lantern storage and other items.
I'm all about the bargain hunting for prep stuff.
Somebody had mentioned the community garden, so I just wanted to have that in people's heads as like an amazing place to build these skills and have as a resource in times of disaster too. So I'm just appreciating the community garden as part of this conversation as well.
I love that.
Definitely. Yeah, Renee, you could probably plug. I know that last year we did like seed saving workshops. I don't know if you want to mention any other ones, but definitely in that like resilient skill building, it's such a great spot.
Yeah, the edible plant walk, which maybe we'll do another one next year. So if you're not already on the Edgewater Environmental Coalition mailing list, our official communications goes out through the newsletter. We did an edible plant walk and do skill sharing and workshops at the garden all year, and we'll be doing more next year in April once it gets nice out again. Hunkering down before then.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, and we have a little bit more if you there's garden adjacent stuff, not to like overpromise Renee and get you in trouble, but like EC is assuming responsibility over the Edgewater Garden, which is at Broadway and I want to say Rosemont, but
Rosemont.
oh, that is right. Okay, Broadway and Rosemont. So especially if you all have ideas for workshops or want to think more about the plant side of this sphere, I think there's some opportunities there to suggest ideas, and we have a little bit more agency now, I think, which is exciting.
And we just final shout out there for EC stuff. We're going to be doing our annual planning meeting at the beginning of January. So keep an eye out for that if you want to bring some of these ideas to EC as things that we could do for next year. And then again, the winter solstice gathering on the 21st.
Absolutely. Renee, do you want to drop an EEC like a newsletter sign up link in the chat as well? I just dropped the Emon one. It's at the bottom of the page if folks have. Awesome. But yeah, feel free to drop some closing thoughts in the chat or unmute. Thank you all so much for coming here today. I think the work Zoe is doing is really incredible, and it's an ideas that I'm really excited to try to introduce more to our community. So I'm so excited that you all were interested and decided to attend, and I hope that you learned something today that will help kind of support your decision making in the future.
I want to say thank you all so much for having me. This has been a pleasure. I do hope you got some takeaways. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you rock, Zoe. Thanks for doing what you're doing. I think TikTok is such a cool format. I feel like it brings in really new audiences to these ideas. So I'm glad that you're out here breaking the
Thank you.
fourth
And
wall.
if y'all follow me on TikTok, send me like a comment or a message or something, and I'll, we can connect more. I love that.
Yeah, and I think also your TikTok has some really good, you had some really good ones. I don't know if you have them flagged at all on kind of like recommendations for affordable stuff to get. Like you have so many tips on there as well.
I do. I try really, because I mean, when I started prepping, it was tight times, and I think, everybody should be looking for the deals when they can. And there's companies that will try, if you start Googling prep supplies, be warned, you're going to get ads for $400 72-hour kit. And that's crazy. Like, you don't fall for it. You can do it all yourself if you just do a little extra reading and stuff.
Definitely. That rocks. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you all. Feel free to hang on and ask questions. Otherwise, I hope everyone enjoys their evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Zoe. It was amazing. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Great job, Zoe.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Everybody's so friendly.
It's a nice group of neighbors. But yeah, Zoe, that was so fantastic. Thank you so
Was
much.
that okay? I was very nervous.
You did so good.
Oh, no, you didn't seem nervous at all. Yeah.
Oh,
Didn't
good.
pick up on that at all.
I'm glad. I hope people got some valuable information.
And we'll send that follow up. And now I have like all these ideas of like all the things I want to do next year.
Renee was like DMing me during the presentation, like, should we do a phone tree? I'm like, yeah, definitely.
I love that. I mean, I really believe that like prepping and mutual aid are at this really unique intersection. And it's like my favorite way to help my community. It's also like my special interest. Like I like enjoy reading about it. So
Yeah. it's like, yeah, it's so cool. And I think, like I said, the work you're doing is really important, and I'm glad to be able to kind of like plant these seeds. So
Thank you.
I'll be sure to like send you little messages as we maybe try some stuff out, and so that we can
Yes.
see the ripple effect of some of these ideas.
I would also love to exchange numbers with you because I know we connect on Instagram, but I would love to connect more.
I'll send you my number. Well, I'll do
Cool.
it right now because that's a good idea. I love,
Cool.
yeah.
Well,
Oh, I
so-
forgot to stop the recording so people get our little special talk at the end.